Fusion as a movement has existed for over 25 years. It was born in the United Kingdom in the late 1990s, and a lot has happened since those early days. So I'm sitting down with Rich Wilson, who was there from the very start, to hear the God story and to see what's happened in the movement since. So Rich, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Miriam.
Now, tell us your story and tell us how Fusion even began.
Well, it very much is a God story. There's no other way to describe it. It started in God, it continues in God, and we are still looking to God for where we go next. I was a student in the early 90s and got caught up with a group of students who saw a bunch of their friends become Christians and they didn't really connect into church. So that I found myself in a student church plant in central England and stayed around because of that. And while staying around, I felt God speak to me about being involved in a student movement for the nation. And I had no real grid for what that looked like. And over the next few years, I discovered I wasn't the only one feeling that. There was a bunch of other leaders around the country who were sensing now is the time to do something more. Culturally, it was quite a different scene back then. 1 million young people had just left the church in the 1990s.
Wow.
And the numbers of college students had swelled 700% in the previous 40 years. And so the universities were now small cities within cities. And whilst there was some faithful Christian work going into the universities, some historic work, there was only a couple of campus ministries in the UK. And they hadn't really grown with the level of student numbers. So we just felt there was more that was needed. So we gathered in a few different places around the UK to seek God and go, what can we do? What must we do?
Right.
And we came up with a very, very simple idea of how about we look to plant small groups in the universities, connected and overseen by local leaders, and see what happens. And that was the beginnings of Fusion in the late 90s. And it started with a handful of small groups. We did a launch conference in London in autumn 1997, kind of sharing the vision. And I guess a whole load of fire starters kind of picked it up and said, you know what, let's try this.
Wow, okay, so huge need, huge kind of growing university population, and not actually the same level of response from the local church that would be required to reach those young adults. And so you guys started with like missional small groups.
Back then, local churches were not really involved in student mission.
Okay.
There was a few historic churches, but compared to the number of churches, you know, a handful of churches really were active in student mission. Students would attend church, but churches would just, you know, welcome them. They'd go in on a Sunday morning and out again, and that would be it.
Right, so not that kind of discipleship journey, that intergenerational piece of kind of doing life together, so to speak.
There was nothing like that.
Right, okay, so Fusion therefore started through planting missional small groups. What happened?
And before we knew it, cells were multiplying. We called them cells back then, kept with the cell movement, but they were really missional small groups. And they were multiplying fast. In Cambridge, they multiplied to 40.
Wow.
In Sheffield, they multiplied to 55. After about 5 years, there was around 500 small groups around the UK in most of the university cities.
Okay, so then what were you doing at this point? Was there a big Fusion team? Like, what did Fusion look like if you've got that many student small groups?
There was 3 or 4 of us.
Oh, amazing. Okay.
Yeah, it was lean. And myself and my friend Jono, my co-worker, we would travel a length and breadth doing small group training.
Right, okay.
We'd invest in the leaders, we'd encourage them, we'd pray for them, and they crack on and get on with it. We supplied them with resources and encouraged them, tried to connect them with some local leaders for accountability, and off they went. And I felt the Lord speak to me about the resources to reach the university are within 5 or 10 miles of the university. And by that, I felt the Lord was saying the local church. And the local church is sleeping on the job. They need awakening to the fact that they have a mandate and a responsibility to reach students and work with them. And after prayer, we threw caution to the wind and said, you know what? We're going to stop counting these Fusion small groups.
Okay.
And we're going to look to empower churches all over the UK to work with students.
Now, what does that look like? So Fusion's about to change its model at this point and go through any and every local church that wants to reach students. What happened next? What was that looking like?
Well, it was catalysed in part by the fact we realised where the small groups were working best was where they were connected with existing local churches.
Right, okay.
So that kind of gave us a bit of a heads up. So we thought we want to celebrate what we want to replicate. And we want to replicate these churches working with students in a sustainable way, creating discipleship culture, missional culture, and invite more churches into that. And initially, we were working with maybe 100, 120 churches, and we were struggling to get beyond that. And then I can only describe it as God went before us.
Wow.
He was speaking to the leaders. And so when we rocked up in the cities and we'd arranged to meet a bunch of people, we found ourselves having this repeat conversation of them saying to us, we've just felt recently we should be doing more with students, more with college students and more with the universities.
Yeah.
But we're not quite sure what to do or how to do it. And we're like, we've had this conversation a few times.
Right.
And the good news is there are some expressions here and here, and some of them are quite similar to you. And we believe you're hearing God right, that now is the time for the church in all its shapes and sizes and across the denominations and streams to get involved in student mission.
So Fusion shifts to a local church model, and so you start training and equipping the local church. So I don't know, let's say we're at 5, 6, 7, maybe up to 10 years into Fusion. What happens next in terms of equipping the church?
Yeah, maybe a little bit longer than that. I think what we saw was a gradual rise. When Fusion started, there was no student workers, college student workers in the churches, maybe a handful.
Sure.
And as we looked at what was going on, we realised a few things. One, there's loads and loads of youth workers.
Yeah.
They've done an incredible
Amazing.
job.
Yeah.
But often, when it comes to the students going off to university, there's nothing.
Right.
And we found a lot of them were just kind of falling off a cliff, not connecting with church. So there was a huge challenge around that. And then we realised when they got to university, churches were well equipped in the youth work, but not in their student work.
Right.
And so we looked at what does it mean for local churches to raise up student workers, and we helped with that. We did loads of training, continue to do loads of training for either full-time, part-time, or volunteer student workers in local church.
Amazing. So you've got a kind of preparation for university and connection to new church when they leave home pathway, and then Fusion's equipping college and university student workers. That didn't used to exist, right? But now that's a pathway in the UK. That's a thing people do as a job, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really obvious why it didn't exist, because there wasn't the numbers of students to warrant it. But
Right.
because they've swelled,
Right.
now there's a need. There's certain questions young people ask, but there's a whole other set of questions that students ask, 18 to 25-year-olds ask.
Yes.
And they're really important questions about who they are, their identity, their purpose. What's God calling them to? How are they going to make a difference with their lives? And that requires particular mentors, input, and the wider church family to help them answer those questions.
And so, we're kind of rocketing towards where we're at today. Fusion is obviously still going in the United Kingdom. What's it looking like now? Like, where are you guys up to?
Well, the number of churches have swelled. We started because we were desperate for student awakening. I feel God's desperate for student awakening.
Yeah.
The reality is, if we'd had an awakening 25 years ago, I'm not sure how much we'd have contained. Now there's a couple of thousand churches around the UK who have connected with Fusion. And it feels like there's some infrastructure in place that if God were to blow on the universities afresh, which we're praying for and we're expecting is going to happen, then there's a whole load more people ready to welcome and disciple. And this is a generation that are desperate. We think they're open. They're also hurting. We want to help them find hope in Jesus and home in the local church.
Yeah.
That's the summary. It's not changed. That some of the methods have changed, but that vision for seeing students reached, that hasn't changed.
Right. So Fusion from its beginnings is kind of missional small groups. Actually, if you look today, over 25 years on, Fusion is still banging the drum for missional small groups led by university students for the sake of their friends. Fusion's grown from actually kind of happening all over to actually only focusing on working through lots of local churches to help the church arise and disciple this generation on the campuses.
Yeah.
And so what are your hopes for the future? Fusion is beginning to spring up in other nations. We've got a whole story in Europe, but actually across the world, there seems like there is a need for the church to really step up to reach the campus. Is there anything else you'd say to kind of sow hope as some of us think about this next season of reaching young people?
Yeah. I mean, the really crazy thing is over the next 25 years, 1 billion students are going to go through the world's universities.
Yeah.
And if there's a church within 5 miles or 10 miles of these universities, which in many nations that are, they've got a huge role to play. What an impact they could have. And so I think now, I mean, I thought 25 years ago was the time, but now is the time to get involved in college and student ministry. And local church, it doesn't matter what size you are, but if there's people who've got a heart for students, a passion for students, this is a kingdom investment. This is something that will change the world if the church can step up in this area. So I'm hopeful that more and more churches are going to get involved in student ministry.
So good. So you've heard a bit of Fusion history from Rich, and keep in touch with Fusion, find out about the story and see how you can play your part as well.